Alright guys, we are finishing up our unit on factoring, and in the last lesson we talked about factoring trinomials when this leading coefficient, this a term, was equal to 1. Today we're going to talk about what happens when that leading coefficient, that a term, equals anything other than 1. So I've written out our steps off to the side over here again so that you guys will have them. So we're going to go through this first example. We are, the first thing we want to look at when we are factoring and this a term right here does not equal 1, we want to look and see if there's a GCF that can be factored out, because sometimes that makes our life a lot easier when we can just pull that out and then we're doing something much simpler when that a is equal to 1. Alright, so we can't factor out a GCF here. They don't share any variables that are all the same. They also aren't sharing any factors. This 14 is not divisible by 3, 8 is not divisible by 3. So there's no GCF here. So we're going to just skip over step 1 and go to step 2. So step 2 says that we multiply a times c. Well, that's our a term. Our c term is 8, so 3 times 8 is 24, and you can see I've done the math over here for you already. And then our b term is 14. So we're looking for two numbers that are going to add up to 24, or I'm sorry, multiply together to give us 24, add to give us 14. So let's start writing down our factors of 24. So we've got obviously 1 times 24, but when I add those together, that's going to give me 25, so that one's not going to work. You could also do 2 times 12. When I add those together, that gives me 14, and that's what I need. Alright, so I'm not going to write any of the other factors down because I have got my winners right there. Okay, so once I have found my factors of AC that add up to B, I'm going to rewrite this b term using these factors. So I've got 3x squared, and then I'm going to rewrite b using these two factors, these two terms. So 3x squared, I'm going to do plus 12x plus 2x plus 8. Alright. I could have written this as, I could have put the 2x first and then the 12x. It really doesn't matter the order, just so long as you rewrite that b term correctly. Alright, now I want to group the first two together. So I'm going to group the first two terms together. Then I'm going to group the second two terms together and find the GCF of each group. So again, here I'm looking at factors of 3 and 12. I know that my GCF of those is going to be a 3, and then they both share the same variables, so they each share 1x. So there's my GCF, 3x. What do I multiply 3x by to get to 3x squared? Well, just an x. What do I multiply 3x by to get to 12x? I multiply it by a positive 4. Alright, I'm adding, so that plus stays the same. Now I'm looking at my GCF here. The GCF of 2x plus 8 is just going to be a 2. Inside my parentheses, 2 times what will give me 2x? X. 2 times what will give me 8? 4. Alright, so I've pulled out my GCF. That is step 5 is done, and now I'm going to do step 6, write them in factored form. I want to make sure that these two are the same, and we want them to be the same because that means that we've factored correctly. So once I've got those two checked off they're the same, I'm going to write the first factor from what comes inside the parentheses, and my second factor comes from these two terms that are outside the parentheses. And that is my answer. Oh, that is my answer. Alright, so this is the factored form of this trinomial right here. Alright, let's jump up to the next example. So same thing, I want to check and make sure that I don't have a GCF that I can factor out. I don't. So what I want to do now is multiply my A and my C together. There's my A, there's my C. So 10 times negative 1 is going to give me a negative 10, and my B is a 3. So I'm going to write down my factors of AC that will add up to B. So let's see. We've got 1 times 10, but it needs to be negative, so this could be negative 1 and 10, or positive 1 times negative 10. And then 2 times 5, but it needs to be negative, so let's do negative 2 times positive 5 and 2 times a negative 5. Alright, if I add these together, negative 1 plus 10 is going to give me a 9. That does not work. 1 plus negative 10 will give me a negative 9. That doesn't work. Negative 2 plus 5 would give me a positive 3, which is what I want. This one down here would give me a negative 3, so that's not it. So these are the factors that I want to use. There's my winner. So I have found my factors of AC that add up to B, so I'm going to rewrite this B term. So I've got 10n squared minus 2n plus 5n minus 1. So this is that minus 2n comes from this one, or this factor here, and the plus 5n comes from this one right here. Alright, I'm going to group the first two terms together, group the second two terms together, and find the GCF of each one. Okay? So let's look at this first one. I've got 10n squared minus 2n. So my GCF is going to be a 2n. 2n times what will give me 10n squared? 5n. So 2 times the 5 gives me the 10, and n times n is n squared. Alright, so the next one, 2n times what will give me a negative 2n? Well, minus 1. Okay, so we're adding, so that plus stays there. Now I want to look at my GCF here. The only thing that they share in common is really a 1, because I can do 5 times 1 and 1 times negative 1, so they both share a 1 in common. So I'm going to write that down there. Open my parentheses, so that means that I'm going to have to multiply this 1 by 5n to get 5n, and multiply that 1 by a negative 1 to get to negative 1. So these two are matchers, which is perfect. That's what we want. That is my first factored term. And the second term, the second set of factors comes from what's outside the parentheses. That's 2n plus 1. And that is my factored trinomial that we started with here. This is what it looks like in factored version. Alright, let's go to the next example. Example 3. Again, I want to multiply my A and my C together. So I have 2 times negative 12, so that's a negative 24. And then I've got to my B, which is a 5. Alright, so my factors of negative 24, I've got 1 times 24, and one of those obviously needs to be a negative. 2 and 12, let's see, 3 and 8, and 4 and 6. Alright, so no matter which one of these two I make negative or positive, there's no way I can get them to add up to 5. So that's not going to work. Same thing here. It doesn't matter if the 2 is negative or the 12 is negative. I can't get those two numbers to add up to 5. Same thing with the 4 and the 6, okay? But I can play around with the negative and positive of these two to figure out how I can get to a positive 5. So if my 3 is positive and my 8 is negative, I would end up with a negative 5. But if my 3 is negative and my 8 is positive, when I add those two numbers together, I would get a positive 5. So that is my winner. So these are the two factors of negative 24 that I'm going to use to rewrite this B term. Alright, so here's where we start. 2y squared, and then I'm going to have minus 3y plus 8y, and then minus 12. I want to group the first two terms together, group the last two terms together, So I'm going to look at this first term and decide what they share in common. Well, 2 and 3 aren't going to share any factors in common, but they do share a variable in common. So I'm going to factor out a y. So y times 2y would give me 2y squared. And y times a negative 3 would give me negative 3y. We're adding, so that adding, the plus sign comes down with us. And now I need to figure out what these have in common. My GCF here is going to be a 4. So I'm going to factor that out. 4 times what will give me 8y? 2y. 4 times what gives me a negative 12? Oh, negative 3. Alright, do my parentheses match? Yes, perfect. So that first factor is 2y minus 3. The second factor comes from what's outside the parentheses, which is y plus 4. And that is the factored version of my trinomial. Alright, let's go to the fourth example. Alright, do I have any GCF that I can factor out? Unfortunately, I do not. So, let's go straight into our AC, multiply those together. So this is my A, this is my B, and this is my C. So A times C, so 20 times negative 1 gives me a negative 20. And my B term is negative 1. So remember, when there's not a number out in front of the variable, that is an implied 1 there. Right there. Okay? So let's write out our factors of negative 20. So we've got 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Okay, so let's see, is there any way if I mean, no matter which one of these two I make negative or positive, the 1 or the 20, I can't make them equal negative 1, so that's not going to work. If I make the 2 negative here and the 10 positive, I'm going to end up with a positive 8. If I make the 2 the positive and the 10 the negative, I would end up with a negative 8. So those don't work either. But luckily these two are going to. So if I want to end up with a negative 1, then the bigger of these two numbers needs to be negative. So that 5 is going to be my negative. So 4 minus 5 gives us a negative 1. So those are my winning factors of negative 20. So I'm going to use these two to rewrite that B term. So we've got 2g squared plus 4g minus 5g minus 1. So now I want to group those first two terms together so I can get the factor out, and group my second two terms together so I can get that greatest common factor out. So when I look at these two here, I know that my GCF is going to be a 4. They also share a variable, so 4g. And then I would need to multiply 4g by 5g in order to get to 20g squared. 4g times what will give me 4g? Well, just a positive 1. Alright, I'm going to continue using that addition sign right there. And then I need to look to see if there's a GCF here. They really don't share a GCF, so the only thing I can factor out is a 1. And then that means that everything inside here just stays the same. Alright, do my parentheses match? Yes, they do. So we've done it correctly again. Good job, guys. And the second factor comes from outside the parentheses, so it's a 4g plus 1. Alright, so there's my factored form of this trinomial. Alright, last example. Alright, so I want to look and see first of all if I have a GCF, which I do. So I can see right off the bat that I have, at a minimum, I've got some variables that they share in common. So I know for sure they've got an x cubed that they share in common. And then let's look at these coefficients out here. So it looks like they're all going to have a 2 in common. So I'm going to factor that out first before I multiply my AC together. So that means that inside my parentheses, I need to figure out what I multiply this 2x cubed by to get to 12x to the fifth. So 2 times 6 would give me the 12, and x cubed times x squared would give me the x to the fifth. Alright, so now do the same thing with this middle term, this b term. So that's going to become 5x, and then lastly would be minus 6. Because this 2 times the negative 6 would give me negative 12, and then that x cubed comes with it. Alright, so I still have to get my AC multiplied together. So this is my A now, this is my B, and that's my C. So I've got 6 times negative 6 is going to give me a negative 36, and my B term is a positive 5. So I want to look and see what my factors are that will add up to give me a positive 5. So let's try, let's see, 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9, and negative 6 and and 6. We just multiplied those together. Okay, so we need to play with these two numbers on all of these to see which ones need to be positive, which ones need to be negative, since our product is a negative number. So no matter which one I choose to be negative or positive, there's no way I can get these two numbers to add up to 5. So this is not going to work. Same thing with 2 and 18. I'm either going to get... let's see, if I make this a negative, then I would end up with a positive 16. If I make this negative, I end up with a negative 16. That's not going to work either. Same thing with 3 and 12. And with my 6's, if one of them's negative and one of them's positive, I'd end up with a 0. So that's not going to work. But I do see right here that depending on which one of these I make negative, I can get a positive 5. So since the number needs to be a positive 5, I want to make the larger of these two numbers positive. So my 9 is going to be a positive and my 4 is going to be negative, because negative 4 plus 9 would give me that positive 5 that I'm looking for. Alright, so these are my factors that I am going to use to rewrite that B term. So I don't want to forget this GCF. That has to carry down with me, okay? So I'm going to rewrite here. So I've got 6x squared, rewrite this B term, minus 4x plus 9x minus 6. Okay? And it might look confusing, but it's not any more confusing than what we've been doing, okay? So I'm still going to group together my first two terms. I'm going to group together my last two terms, okay? So I want to keep that GCF on there. Don't forget it. That's a big thing. A lot of people want to forget that and not bring it down with them. Alright, so my GCF here is going to be, let's see, they share a 2x. And then inside my parentheses, 2x times what gives me 6x squared, 3x minus 2. So this is my GCF of this first grouped terms. And then my addition sign carries down with me as well. And then I want to find my GCF here. So my GCF of these last two terms that we've grouped together is going to be a 3. 3 times what gives me 9x? Well, 3x. 3 times what gives me a negative 6? A negative 2. Perfect. And then I want to close that first set of parentheses right there. Okay, so we know that this is going to stay with us. Our first factored term comes from what's inside the parentheses, those matchers. So that's 3x minus 2. And then our last factor comes from this two terms that are outside of our parentheses. So 2x plus 3. Alright, so that is our final answer. It's really not any harder to factor when we can start off pulling that GCF out. We just have to remember that we bring it with us, okay? A lot of people want to forget about it. Just don't forget about it. Let it tag along with us all the way to the end. All right, guys, let me know if you have any questions.